Apple has been trying to push the iPad line of tablets as a computer for years now, through elaborate marketing campaigns that have been
"What's a computer?"
questionable at best, and through a ton of improvements to iPadOS to make it feel even more computer-like. Just enough to where they can say it's a computer, but not quite enough to hurt the MacBook sales. So over the last few weeks, I put Apple's marketing, software, and hardware to the test. I produced the entirety of my last video, the Steam Deck PCVR one, on this iPad that I'm holding. It definitely had some issues, but honestly, it was a much better experience than I thought it would be. And depending on your workflow, you might not even need a MacBook altogether. I guess I've never really given insight onto how I've made my videos before, so this is it. Currently, I use Trello to organize all of my ideas and schedule when I want to do them. I use Apple Notes and Coda to write notes for my reviews, primarily Apple Notes just for that quick open and get something written down. I write my scripts in Coda, shoot my videos with my iPhone and Blackmagic camera, then I move everything over to this Sabrent Nano external SSD and edit from the drive in either Premiere Pro or Final Cut. Premiere has been my main editing software for the first year and a half of this channel, but I've been trying to familiarize myself with Final Cut, and that's what I've edited my last few videos in. Once the video is edited, I use Procreate or Pixelmator Pro to create my thumbnail or some combination of the two, and then I upload and I promote by posting a story to Instagram and making a post. If you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that most of these tools are very easy to run on iPad, and yeah, you'd be right. Hell, Procreate only runs on iPad. The biggest challenge here in my workflow was the video editing part, but I'll get to that later. Okay, starting with brainstorming, again, this is literally Trello, Apple Notes, and Coda. I really like Coda. Not sponsored, but I've talked to the team before. What's up, Ben? Literally all of these tools could run on a Chromebook if you tried hard enough. Even Apple Notes can be accessed through the iCloud web portal. The Apple Notes app is obviously excellent on iPad. It feels like its own product, but it still feels like a desktop app. It doesn't just clone the macOS app. It's really nice. Trello's app is fairly decent. It retains most of the functionality of the website and the desktop app, but it just has a few little quirks when comparing it to those, particularly when you're using a keyboard and mouse, which I did for a lot of this production. On the website, if you click and drag a card, it moves immediately. On the app, you need to hold it down for a bit before you start moving it. It's very touch optimized, and things like that weren't a deal breaker for me, but if they were for you, you could just use the Trello website in Safari, considering that iPad Safari is literally just a desktop browser. And as much as I love Coda, their iPad app could definitely use some work. It's essentially just a scaled version of the mobile app and misses a ton of functionality from the desktop site, like creating folders. The Coda site works excellently in Safari, and that's what I've been using. While I'm talking software, this isn't something I currently use in my videos. I've used it before. I want to give a massive shout out to Obsidian, because the iPad app is literally just the desktop app. There is no difference. Not a single feature is missing. Even the third-party plugins work. I need every single iPad app to work like this, particularly Final Cut. I'm going to have a very long rant about Final Cut for iPad later. A lot of Apple's other non-creative apps work excellently when you use the iPad as a desktop. Logic Pro is, as far as I can tell, the only creative app that has full feature parity with the Mac version. I don't know why it's only Logic Pro. Why not have it for iMovie, GarageBand, and Final Cut? Probably money. I'll get to that later. The brainstorming process did not change one bit. There wasn't a single piece of software that I had to swap out, and everything worked the exact same way as it did on my Mac. The main things I started learning during this brainstorming and scripting process were the quirks of using an iPad like a computer, and I was able to get used to them before I started the video editing part, which was going to be probably very jarring. Mainly, multi-window multitasking and second monitor support is still lacking in a lot of departments. Stage Manager isn't very flexible on iPad and it only allows you to resize windows in certain dimensions. And those dimensions aren't always available for every app. DaVinci Resolve, for example, can't extend to take up a full 16:9 monitor and is stuck at that 4:3 iPad aspect ratio. Stage Manager also only allows 4 windows on a screen at once. However, that's per monitor, so connecting a second monitor allows you to run 8 windows at once on your iPad. iPadOS allows you to rearrange your monitor setup, but you can only choose from 4 preset positions for some reason, which is in stark contrast to the flexibility of macOS. And if you're using a second monitor, for some reason you can't screen record it. You also can't plug in the iPad and close it to only use the external display for some reason, nor are you able to set the external display as your primary one. The most immediate obvious difference between using a Mac and an iPad as soon as you connect a mouse is the cursor. The circle kind of seems unintuitive at first, but it does an excellent job at bridging the gap between a desktop workflow and a touch-centric operating system. The cursor adapts to most touch points and helps a ton in desktop-centric apps. If you don't like the way the circle adapts to the things you're hovering over, you can change an accessibility setting that makes it act more similarly to a standard macOS cursor. I was using my MX Master 3 with my iPad for a lot of the actual serious work with the mouse and keyboard, and while that one worked great, the only major issue I had was that the scrolling was very jumpy. It would go one or multiple pages with each bump of the scroll wheel. If you're planning on using the iPad as your primary workstation, you'd probably be better off going with a different mouse. Obviously, Apple's first-party options are going to work best here, and your mileage may vary when you use third-party accessories. The MX Master works flawlessly otherwise. Even the side scroll wheel adapted and worked in DaVinci and Final Cut and Safari. During this segment of my research, I very quickly realized that, again, I would need a keyboard and mouse to do any actual serious work. My Acco mechanical keyboard, MX Master 3, and external storage connected immediately over my USB-C dock when I just swapped out the MacBook for the iPad. The only thing I didn't like about connecting external storage is the lack of eject button. I know it's probably not even that necessary, but it just feels weird to unplug something without clicking eject, especially considering that macOS still yells at you every time you do it. And Apple's Magic Keyboard is an excellent experience when I'm out and about. It makes using the iPad just feel like a modern netbook. I love this thing. Even now, again, I'm still using it. I was using it at my desk to write this script. My only real gripe with the Magic Keyboard is the lack of escape key. I ended up just rebinding caps lock to escape, seeing as I never use caps lock anyway. However, the keyboard on the touchscreen isn't too bad. It has a decent size to it, and I assume it would be closer to a full size if you were using the nearly 13-inch iPad Pro instead of the 11-inch like I have, and I can almost reach just under 100 words a minute. For reference, I got 114 words a minute the first time I did a typing test on the Magic Keyboard, and my personal best on my desktop keyboard is 150. I managed to get this for an absolute bargain on eBay. I only paid around 110 Australian dollars shipped, which is a much easier price to swallow compared to the $489 it costs to buy this brand new. The lack of function keys is also kind of annoying when you compare it to a MacBook keyboard, but I use a compact board at my desk that doesn't have function keys anyway, so I got used to it fairly quickly. Obviously, it doesn't really make sense to shoot on iPad. The cameras are just not up to par with the ones seen on the iPhone, even with Apple's ProRes codec being funneled into the Final Cut app. This segment is shot on iPad with the built-in microphones, just to give you an idea of what your content would look like if you're trying to do entirely iPad. Nothing else has changed from the iPhone segment, just the camera and the microphone. I still shot on iPhone for the top-down intro and outro of the Steam Deck PC VR video, with the only exception being the segments recorded on the Quest 3, which were recorded on the Quest 3. However, I did want to use the iPad as much as I possibly could, so I recorded my audio for the top-down shots in GarageBand, just plugging this microphone straight into the iPad. Unlike what I usually do, which is just plugging it straight into the camera. Recording my audio worked pretty well, except when GarageBand just stopped recording after I tried to open the MetaQuest app on the iPad. So I'm just gonna try and bring up the Quest app over here as well. No, why would I be able to do that, you know? Why would that work? The recording stopped. Most professional camera apps like Blackmagic Camera and Filmic Pro still run on iPad to give you manual control and features like ProRes, and the Final Cut app is probably the best iPad optimized one that gives you all of those manual controls, which should just be in the camera app, especially on the iPhone. And it really annoys me that they built a camera that has those professional controls and they don't give us to us on the device they want you to make films on. Apple! Sorry. Okay, that part's done. So I'm watching this. The iPad cameras were a lot better than I thought they were. I thought they were terrible, but no, that's pretty good. Like, I have natural lighting, but still, damn. Ingesting my footage from Blackmagic Camera on my iPhone to the iPad was, again, the exact same process as the Mac, really. I just plugged the SSD into my phone, moved the footage over, and plugged that SSD into the iPad. If I wanted to save some time, I could have shot straight to the SSD, but I figured that's somewhat more unreliable, and I've already got my microphone plugged in over the USB-C port, so Getting started on the edit was a bit tougher than it usually is. At first, I tried Final Cut for iPad. It seemed like the best option, seeing as I've used the iPad Final Cut before for smaller edits, like the live graphics in my MetaQuest 3 video, and I primarily edit in Final Cut on my Mac nowadays. The Final Cut app on iPad is clearly built from the ground up, and includes a nice touch-optimized UI with a few extra features here and there. But realistically, you have no chance of replacing Final Cut on Mac with the iPad version. And honestly, there's no excuse to why it shouldn't be able to replace the Mac version. Final Cut on iPad is missing absolutely crucial features, like selecting a drive to store your project files, or just basic shit like motion tracking. You can't even jump from an iPad to a Mac while editing. You can go from iPad to Mac, but that's it. You can't cross paths like you can with the Logic Pro. Now, here's my rant. There is no excuse for Apple to have Final Cut working without feature parity on the iPad. And if you're wondering, oh, why are you so mad over this? I've got a pretty good answer, I'd say. My iPad is the same as the MacBook with the full Final Cut. Both devices have a base M2 processor, 256 gigs of storage, 8 gigs of RAM, and one of them just doesn't get the full Final Cut for what only appears to be a way to get you to buy a Mac and drop another 500 Australian dollars to actually do the things you want to do. And they do all of this after having the audacity to charge you $8 a month Australian for the version of Final Cut that they smashed in the kneecaps with a bat before they shipped onto the App Store. Apple realistically should just be shipping the full desktop Final Cut on iPad, even if they charge the same price for it. Although I'd expect it to move over to the iPad if I bought it on the Mac. This, of course, does not happen currently with the Final Cut iPad and Mac version, and Final Cut for iPad is not included in Apple One, which is a bit of a bummer. Apple calling the smash kneecap version of Final Cut they made for the iPad Final Cut Pro is legitimately misleading. It implies that it is the same app, just on the iPad, and it is not. And my other reason for believing there should be feature parity? DaVinci Resolve is a direct port of the desktop app with complete feature parity and the ability to work on projects across a desktop and an iPad, syncing both ways, and it's free. DaVinci doesn't even need an M series chip like Final Cut for iPad. It works on the A12. You could be taking the same software that best-in-class color graders in Hollywood are running on their $1,000 Mac Pros and running it on your iPad mini. Not even the 5th gen with a home button. And it's for those reasons that I decided learning DaVinci Resolve from scratch would be a better experience than using Final Cut for iPad. I also noticed that DaVinci was fairly similar to Final Cut in terms of its keyboard shortcuts and editing style, so it was fairly simple to get started. As I mentioned, DaVinci is the same app that is on the desktop, and it's essentially the full experience. One thing you might notice is that some pages that are available on the desktop version are hidden by default, but you can just connect a keyboard and bind shortcuts to the hidden pages to use them on iPad. Some of those pages are missing functionality or not optimized, which is probably why they're hidden. Specifically, in my use case, Fairlight wouldn't let me record a voiceover, so I had to just use voice memos. However, at least Blackmagic lets you have access to them. Apple? I did have some performance issues at the start, which I think had to do with the audio processing I applied to the clips I was editing. I also turned on the rendering cache, which solved a lot of my issues at the cost of using 160 gigabytes of my internal storage. Very glad I got the 256 instead of the 128. I tried to set the render cache to use the external drive I was editing off of, but that caused multiple full system lockups. It's fairly simple to delete the render cache in the Files app once you're done by just browsing the Resolve files in the On My iPad section, or you can use a keyboard shortcut to access the built-in cache manager for more precision in what you're deleting. The editing process, once I got started, was excellent. I very rarely ran into performance issues, and I was able to apply all of the same effects and editing techniques I use in Premiere and Final Cut on my desktop. It was genuinely 100 times better than I expected it to be. Even using DaVinci's touch interface for some A-roll cutting while I was in my car was really good, despite the fact that it's very clearly not optimized for touchscreen use. Even intensive effects like video stabilization ran without a hitch once I turned on the rendering cache. Towards the end of the project, however, I did start having some pretty big performance issues. This was once the project had reached about 20 minutes at this point. The audio was starting to play out of sync, media wasn't importing, audio from things that I deleted were just still playing in the timeline, and just general freezing and lockups. Closing the apps running in the background that weren't DaVinci and restarting the iPad seemed to fix all of those issues. I did assume at first that this was because of the RAM allocation being lower in iPadOS compared to macOS, but I found out that that has been fixed, and iPadOS on my model with 8 gigs of RAM allows apps to use up to 6 gigs of RAM. And if you've got one of the big boy 16 gig RAM versions, those apps can use up to 12 gigs of RAM. I feel like the project definitely would have run better on one of those 16 gigabytes of RAM iPads, but it's not as big of an issue as I first thought it was. Now, the iPad did get absolutely thrashed when I ran my rendering test. This wasn't very scientific if I'm being 100% honest with you, but it can kind of give you an idea of how you can expect the iPad to perform when stacked up against the Mac with the same specs. That's still insane for me. Rendering the project on my iPad with media from both the internal and external drive in 4K with the H.264 master preset in DaVinci took just over 23 minutes. To emulate the same conditions on my Mac, I put the same content that was coming from the internal iPad drive onto the internal Mac drive and just exported the project file onto my external drive. The only real hiccup I ran into while switching between the Mac and the iPad is that the project files were offline the first time I moved to my Mac. but I just had to select the drive to relink everything and everything worked again. I'm assuming this is because of the differences in how macOS and iPadOS handle file system structures, and this should only happen once as far as I'm aware. There was one file that was in the video that I could not find for the life of me, so I replaced it with a similar video with the exact same time, resolution, frame rate, etc. Rendering that project on my Mac took around 13 minutes, over 10 minutes faster than the iPad. Overall, my editing experience on the iPad was pretty good. After I got past the performance issues and Final Cut, it just felt like I was editing on a smaller MacBook, because that's basically what it is. I do think that if my editing workflow was more intensive, like using a lot of visual effects, higher frame rate, or making longer videos, the iPad probably wouldn't have been able to keep up. But as it stands, it worked excellently for my workflow. Okay, now for the thumbnail. My thumbnails are fairly simple. I usually take a photo of the product or a photo that represents what I'm doing and add some hand-drawn or other digital elements around it. That usually involves some text, maybe a logo, and occasionally an arrow to make people actually want to click the video. That has proven to work wonders on my content for some reason. I still took the photo on my phone, but I think this would be the easiest part to get away with using the built-in iPad camera. Realistically, the viewers aren't pixel peeping a thumbnail, and probably wouldn't notice the difference in quality. After I took a photo I liked, I airdropped the photo over to the iPad and imported it into Procreate. I didn't do it for this thumbnail, but when I need to mask the background or remove from an object, do like perspective effects and that, I usually just take advantage of the built-in masking in the Photos app and align it in Procreate. Out of my last 5 videos, 3 of those thumbnails were made entirely in Procreate, with one of them requiring a bit more work in Pixelmator Pro, and the other being made entirely in Pixelmator Pro. One thing I would like to see from Procreate is the ability to just strip a background from an image within the app. I realize that's probably not the intended use case, but I feel like it could be useful to people like me making thumbnails, and hey, I don't know, artists might have a use for it. I feel like it shouldn't be that hard to do, maybe? I don't know. I'm not a developer. I got no idea. Publishing on iPad was a bit interesting. At first, I tried using the YouTube Studio app to publish my video, but that only lets you publish from your photo library, and my video was in files, and I really couldn't be bothered to move it to Photos, so I just used the YouTube Studio website in Safari. Besides, the YouTube Studio app doesn't have full feature parity with the desktop site. You can't add things like end screens and things like that. Because I was literally just using the website, the process was again the exact same as my Mac. After upload, I went into Mercury by Stream Elements to add my dynamic description templates and write up the video specific description. I went ahead and added the thumbnail to YouTube Studio and set the video to public, entirely from my iPad. My promotion workflow is fairly simple. I open up the Instagram app, I post a post, and I post a story. You can follow me at Could Be Hades, link in the description. So I didn't really have to do much. I shot one extra photo on my iPad of the Steam Deck and the VR headset, and then opened up the Instagram post where I was immediately reminded, again, that Meta hates iPad users because of the big black bars that were on either side of my screen while I was using the unoptimized iPhone app. Even though Instagram is optimized for foldables on Android, I'm not gonna do another rant. I was still able to make my post without any issues, despite the fact that the app is not optimized for iPad. I could have done that part, making the post, from my desktop, but what I couldn't have done is post a story, which I was able to do without taking my hands off the iPad's keyboard and without an extra device, which was really helpful. So, should you do this? Honestly, this was a much better experience than I thought it would be. I thought this would be immediate, no, don't do this, buy a Mac. Because I've been basically a professional iPad kid for a while now, and it didn't even really click how good the iPad has gotten for actual real video work since the days of LumaFusion being the best editor on the iPad. It's still so disappointing how neglected Final Cut for iPad feels in comparison to its sibling on the Mac, and I wish that more iPad apps just had feature parity with desktop. But other than that, it was a great experience. One thing to note is this would be basically impossible, or at least very difficult if you're shooting with anything more advanced than like a mid-range mirrorless camera. I feel like the editors at MKBHD, for example, would have a very tough time editing Red 8K footage on the iPad. Studio channel, free video idea. Come on. None of you are probably watching this, but Marquez, you know you want to. You know you want to edit red footage on an iPad. Come on, do it, bro. Free idea, no credit needed. It'd be cool though, but no, don't worry about it. It's a free idea. The iPad though is an especially great setup for people starting out as content creators, for people who just want to work on the go, or even just generally people without big workflows. I can absolutely see myself using the iPad in the future as an editing machine to quickly cut some A-roll or finish off some quick effects, which are perfect for what Final Cut for iPad could do, but I'm still really disappointed in it, before finalizing my end product on my main setup over there. Again, I did a lot of the preparation and file consolidation and research for this video on my iPad, and that wasn't even part of the challenge. The iPad has come such a long way, and I absolutely think it's unfair to dismiss doing actual serious work on it just because it used to not be great at that. I can't wait to see how much better the iPad gets. And it'll be very interesting to see what Apple has cooking for those ultra-thin iPad Pros that are supposed to be coming out apparently next week in a press release. No event, that's kind of sad. I kind of wanted to make an event video. Anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to see the end result of this video, where the one I edited on my iPad, you can check out the video where I try to run PCVR games on my Steam Deck over here. Or you can pick something the algorithm thinks you'll like over here. If you like this video, you know what button to press, and if you really like this video, maybe even hit subscribe. I've just placed a pre-order on my Rabbit R1, and I'll absolutely have a video on that coming when I get it. So you'll definitely want to sub for that. I can't wait to check out that device. It seems really cool. You can follow me over on Twitter, Instagram, and basically everything else with the links that are on screen now and in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.